let's go ahead and start. This is critical path. The critical path, of course, is the shortest distance between 2 points, making sure you don't miss any steps along the way, of course. That's important too. And shifting, the economic paradigm, shifting, changing. Economics, eco means house, nomi means rules. So, and a paradigm, set of assumptions, right? So we're talking about changing the assumptions about the house rules. And it's a Greek word, so, right? The economy, the household, was the center of the economy. It was where all those economic decisions got made, taking care of the house, right? And so that's how that word evolved. In the 20s, there was this fellow going around the country trying to educate people about money and credit because he saw the Depression looming. He saw what bankers were doing, saw the speculation, knew that it was going to go down. And so he was out telling people, hey, it's going to go down. There's stuff we can do. Turn this around. He said, political democracy can go no further in freeing man until itself is emancipated by an economic democracy whose sheathed sword is money. And what he meant by that was that money springs only from trade. It is not, money is not created to do trade. The real money is created at the point of trade. And so what we have is a monopoly where the banks control the trade. And he knew that. He was a non-academic student of money and credit. I too am a non-academic student of money and credit. I did not go to college to learn about economics, and David Suzuki tells me that's a good idea not to. I grew up interested in building things, and so I was always dragging home materials and figuring out how to build stuff with them. And I remember at 7 years old really happy that I built one that I could stand up in, you know. It was really important to me. And as a young man, I got into architecture and working for architects and stuff, but then along came the 60s and dropping out, tuning in, turning on and all that, and so I joined the crowd on that one. And I ended up on the farm, which was a big collective community in southern middle Tennessee. And for 10 years, we were a collective. And at some point, the banks stepped in and shut our collective down because they were calling in the note that we had overextended ourselves in farming. But during that time, we got into passive solar design, and so my interest in architecture was re-sparked, you know, because of architecture. So I got in, when I left the farm, because I was non-cooperative, right? I mean, they were collective changing to a cooperative. So I went to Nashville and got my license for being an architect, but it wasn't very easy because they didn't want to let somebody who hadn't gone to college become an architect. Well, I showed them the rule that they still had in the law that said that you could take the exam if you had fulfilled the NCARB requirements. And I had fulfilled the NCARB requirements of working in various disciplines within the industry, so they had to let me take the exam. Well, the civil servant worker wasn't going to let me take it, so here I was coming up against the state. And so I went to the chairman of the board that I happened to met in a study group of architects. A bunch of interns had invited me to come and study with them for the exam. And so this fellow was the chairman of the board. Well, his office happened to be upstairs, so I went upstairs and said, they're stonewalling me. They won't let me take the exam because I'm not a degree, I didn't go to college. He said, well, let's go talk to him, because he knew I knew what I was doing. So we went down and talked to him. He talked to him for a little bit, and they went through all the excuses why this fella who was uneducated shouldn't get to do it. And Mr. Street, who was very nice, explained to the lady how I had done all of these things. and so I should get to take the exam. So I got to take the exam, passed at the first sitting, and I was an architect all of a sudden, which was nice. So, because I got into, about that time, into straw bale construction and eco-construction and earth building, and learning about that from Jano Evans. He's a Welsh architect, or it was a landscape architect, who went around showing people how to burn wood efficiently around the world. Anyway, he taught us about building with earth and straw, and so we've been out teaching people that, and then we've been helping owner builders do those kinds of things too. So that's kind of how I get my bread and butter a little bit. But then the Green Party in 2000, we had been trying to get the Green Party going for a while in Tennessee, but in 2000 it took off, right? Because we had this great campaign to go on. And so it was formed in 2001. And I started running for offices in 2006, and just to be a candidate to help build the party out there. And one of the things that I discovered right away was that needed an economic program. I needed to be able to talk about economics, so I started studying economics and studying how that stuff works, trying to understand it. And we got right into the money. And Catherine Austin Fitts, who was the former secretary of HUD, assistant secretary, and so she was a financial whiz that had been brought in by the Clinton administration. And actually it was by the Bush administration before Clinton, and because she was really good with numbers. Well, she asked the Bush administration for the balance sheet so she could figure out what was going on in HUD, and they fired her. Well, Clinton's then was elected and said, okay, she must be pretty good. She got fired by Bush, so let's bring her in. She got in, she says, I'd like to see the balance sheet for HUD. Oh, you're fired. They didn't want them looking at the finances of what was going on in HUD because they were laundering money for the drug cartels. But she gave us an idea about moving the money in 2007 before the crash in 2008. And so we started trying to get people to move the money, and we started the Green Party campaign, Move the Money to Main Street. You might have seen a little bit about moving your money out of banks, especially the top 20 banks, and getting them into credit unions. Mostly that would be the best way to go. Credit unions, or start your own local bank. And it later did catch on. Kyle Thurman did a video about it that was real good, pumping it up a little bit, but then the crash happened and more people got into it, and more. And today, there's quite a bit of moving the money talk out there, which is a good thing. And I live there, by the way. Katie and I live out here.
Out there, that's where we live.
Where was it? Right there. We live there. This is the Buffalo River. So we're kind of out in the boonies, and we've got a little town of about 900 people, about 3 miles away. And so we've been massaging that group mind for the last few years. I want to talk about shifting paradigms. Do they ever shift? And of course they do. Because at one time people believed the earth was the center of the universe, right? And then somebody said, no, my computation shows differently, and that changed a whole lot because people were understanding it differently. In the same way with flying, man cannot fly until he flew. And so we have this enormous problem of a paradigm that is destroying our planet. And we need to change that paradigm. We need to change that set of assumptions that's doing that. And what are those assumptions? I'd say there's 2 obstacles. One is money, and one is human behavior. And those 2 are things that you hear everywhere. Everybody's always talking about. We don't have enough money to do this thing that we need to do. And they won't do it right. So we've always got that kind of thing that we're bucking. And what I want to talk about here today is there's also this normalcy bias where they're used to normal, and so they don't really want to change anything, because normal, and of course television makes it happen fast in people's minds. They get the message, it goes subconscious, they follow the rules. We want to change that. And complementary currencies, turns out, is a method for doing both. It not only will help with the money issue, it'll help with the human behavior issue. And that's the fascinating thing that I found about complementary currencies and what they do. So what are some of those things we have in our mind? Money doesn't grow on trees, right? Well, does it really? Actually, it does grow on trees, because that is wealth. You can eat that. You can't eat money. You can't, that was pointed out, right, a long time ago. Is there a shortage of food? There's not a shortage of food. There's a shortage of distributing the food fairly. We all know that the industrial world throws away enough food to feed the rest of the world every week. So it's about distribution. It's not, and of course the excuse is we can't afford to feed the world. We can't afford to give everybody electricity, but it's a renewable resource. So is food, right? So is education. I mean, it's me helping you come out. We help each other. That's education. Education can happen anywhere. Doesn't need a prison-like school building to, and that's not education anyway. That's what do they call that? Pedagogy. That's an old Roman term for a eunuch who, or somebody who was just training students in rote knowledge, not how to think, not how to become an adult or learn how to live. It was just rote knowledge. And that's what's going on in most of the schools. And except for those heroes, those teachers who break the rules and teach somebody something. Help them come out. Well, healthcare is that way too. It's taking care of one another, taking care of each other is a big part of what healthcare is about. So we have this meme, or this assumption, this paradigm of scarce resources, not enough to go around, and unlimited wants and needs. How are we going to do that? Well, in the case of food, you can only eat so much or you start going into obesity and start having health problems, right? So that's ridiculous. It's just that we need enough food, and that's not scarce either. So what we want to change it to is abundant resources sufficient to all our needs. And we can do this. We're familiar with the symptoms of the disease. All of these things are happening: desertification, climate change, extinctions, wars, pollution, toxic. I mean, the list goes on, right? And as Charles Eisenstein says, if you dig beneath every surface of every issue, you will soon come to money. Underneath every one of those issues, it's about money. Because the economy is at the heart of it. Remember the fella, Gaylord Nelson, who started Earth Day, right? The economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment, not the other way around. And so is society, as far as that goes. So the environment is what we're within, and the economy is within our society. It is central to how we think and react and do things with each other. It's about economic exchange. And of course, there's the gift I give to you, there's the theft I take from you, or there's the reciprocal exchange, and that's money. That's where I give you something and you give me something. So it's a reciprocal exchange, basically. Why do we need money? What do we need it for at all? Well, division of labor makes it that we have to have money, because what does that do? That means one person is producing something, really good at it, and they produce a lot of it. They've got to trade that productivity for everything else they need. That's why we needed money. And we've had money for a very long time. Native Americans used money. They called it wampum, but it was sacred to them. It was a sacred exchange. It was a sacred agreement between them. Since the dawn of time, monetary systems have controlled everything. They go through our education, food, everything that people do, there's money involved. That's the way our system works. And that's the way it's worked for a very long time. It's the most influential of human-made systems. And I want to point out, and I do at some point here, that much of it is subconscious. Economic evolution, the stages in development of the process of reciprocal exchange. There was the barter and trade thing, which in a small community you can do. You can do a lot of barter and trade. You don't need money for that kind of a situation where it's real simple, you know. And we do that. We do that with neighbors a lot of times. And commodity money, and then they came up with, well, this commodity, this cow, it could represent, you know, so much of this other thing. And they used commodities or gold, diamonds, that's another commodity, right, that can be used for money. And so that was another form of money. And then there's symbolic money. Now, symbolic money was, okay, you had something that represented that cow or whatever standard of value that you had. And symbolic money was used by indigenous peoples. George is wearing money. He's got money on his wrist there. Those cowrie shells used to be used for money, and still are in some places around the world. Credit money is what we have today, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. The new money is credit clearing money, and it's very similar to credit money, but there's a significant difference, and we'll tell you about that in a minute. I want to talk about another one of those memes that we picked up before we were 7 years old. Love money is the root of evil. Now, George Bernard Shaw said, well, it's the lack of money that's the root of all evil, I tell you that. But really, I want to talk about it is the root of evil because it gives us this: corruption, fear, torture, repression, war. You know, love of money is the root of evil, and that's why we got Dick Cheney. I'll tell you why that is. What is money? Money, it's energy, right? It's information. It's a benefit. That's hardwired. Everybody knows that it's a benefit because of the separation of labor. And it's a social technology. But it's helpful to understand money as an agreement because an agreement can be changed, right? It's not solid. Money is mostly in our head. Money is an agreement to use something for an exchange, an economic exchange. That's all it is. But 5% of it is conscious, and 95% of it is unconscious or subconscious. And this is because we only use our conscious creative mind 5% of the time. And what that mind does, it's very creative, and it finds things that it likes, it forms a habit, and that goes subconscious. Well, a lot of that stuff you picked up from your parents before you were 7. So think about some of the ways that money was regarded in your family when you were a little child. And a lot of those things are how you think and react to money subconsciously. The functions of money, it is that means of exchange that we were talking about, and that's basically all it has to be. But you have to have something that is a standard of value, and the money can be the standard of value. You can make it a store of wealth, like the dollar is a store of wealth. That is, you can put it in the bank and it doesn't degrade, it stays that, it's still worth $1, right, at the end. Now there may be some adjustments going on out there, but it's basically, in the economy, that's what it's worth. But this is the problem. This is where love of money comes from. Where suddenly, instead of just a means of exchange, it's a store of wealth. and suddenly it's a commodity. It's a commodity worth something that I can go out and buy a whole refrigerator full of food in a week. That stuff is rotten. But if I put the money in the bank, it didn't. And that's the problem. That is disconnected us from nature. It has disconnected us from the planet because money became a commodity. It also became a tool of speculative profit, right? Because it was a store of value. And so it became a tool of speculation. It also has been used as a tool for empire. You know, the British did that. You know, they come into Africa at one point and did a cost analysis, said it's going to cost us way too much to send the army in and take over all these villages. How about we just make a tax and make them have to pay it in our money, right? The empire's money. So then the natives had to do something to get, who had the money? The British. So they had to do something for the British to get the money so they could pay their taxes, right? Talk about a clever way of taking over people. And it is a behavior modifier. This causes a lot of bad behavior, and we'll talk about how it does that and why in a minute. But all of these functions are in the dollar. Now, currency experts will tell you that it's not a good idea to have your currency doing all of these things because that's very undemocratic, really, for one thing. And no currency is that flexible to take care of all of these kinds of functions in a society. But what's required to have an efficient, effective, fair exchange? And here's the one where lots of people their mind shuts and their eyes close, and they don't want to look at these words, these two words called free markets. Because for so long, it's been people telling us that we needed free markets, and they were people who were just terrible people telling us that we had to have free markets, and they were doing these awful things, and it was all because we had free markets that this has to happen, but we don't have a free market. There's never been a free market in this country, not since the revolution. There was a free market, it was freer than it is today, but there was a free market before the revolution, and when they made their money outlawed, that's what set off the revolution. You know, after 10 years, it sent them into the economic doldrums, and to the point where, and they knew why. You know, they had memory back then. And you need free markets so that you can exchange your productivity freely. And you need an honest medium of exchange, so the dollar ain't gonna work, it's not honest, right? And the objective, stable unit of measure. And that's what the dollar is being used for. But that could also be done by a democratic local board that determined what the values were of things. How dollars are created right now is that it's at the instance of a loan. All the money in this world, it's not just this country, it's every country, makes their money by issuing loans that is interest-bearing debt. So every country does this. Why do they do this? I'll tell you in a minute. But the principal is created and not the interest. All right, you see a problem already? All the money that's created is just the principal, but there's all this interest that has to be paid. So what has to happen? Well, it creates a few winners and lots of losers. That's what your boom and bust business cycle is. You know, it boom, 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 boom. Lots of people are invested, then it busts, and what? People lose their houses, people lose their business, and who gets it? The banks. That's the business boom and bust cycle, and it's driven by the monetary system. It's the way money is issued that creates that situation. It was banned by the church for a very long time. Now this stemmed back into our indigenous roots that interest was a sin. Interest, paying interest on a loan, that that was just unheard of. And for a very long time, the church banned it. But along about right at the end of the Middle Ages, the church had a case come before them about it, and they said, you know what? We're not going to make a decision on that. So they let this person charge interest without excommunicating. Right? It was some case back in that period of time. Along about 1822, they finally formalized that it was okay, you know, that it wasn't a problem. But of course it is. Because it's a fundamental structural flaw in the monetary system. And here's why. These are interest flows. This is figures from Germany in 1982. But it is like this in every country every year because of the way their money is issued. All right? So there's a certain number in the population that gets the interest and everybody else is paying it. Systematic concentration of wealth. There's this great movie called Rock the Cradle. Anybody ever seen that movie? Rock the Cradle, it's a story about the 1930s. It's a story about the theater movement, actually, in it. But it also hooks up all of the other stuff that was, or some of the other stuff that was going on during that time. And one of the scenes shows the robber barons. It's Henry Ford, and it's J.P. Morgan and Warburg, and all of these guys. They're at a big party smoking cigars and laughing, you know. And Ford says something to J.P. Morgan, and J.P. Morgan says, yeah, but you can't beat our system. We get paid to be rich. And it's true. They get paid to be rich. Well, nature is a network. Nature is the only model of sustainability that we have in this world. And it's a network. What kind of network? Well, this is non-network. 42 dots, by the way. That's the answer to the meaning of the universe, right? 42. Anyway, there's a centralized system, right? It's not a very structural system, you know, because all those tension members, they don't really create a structure. Decentralized, you're getting a little bit better, but nature is a dispersed network. It is all these little nodes connected to all these other little nodes, creating the web of life, right? And that's why it's sustainable, because when one goes down, another one goes up. When one goes down, another one comes up, helps balance that system and heal that web as best it can. And of course, we're doing our best as humans to try and wipe it out, but I'm going to make the argument that it's our monetary system that's doing that, and it's doing it worldwide. Because, as I was talking about, I like this thing because here's why I like this poster. Because they're both monopoly. You know, this is a monopoly. It's made a monopoly by the government that says you can only pay your taxes in this. This is the only legal tender allowed. And every country is like that. Every country has a legal tender. It's the only one allowed. Why? It's the foreign exchange reserve currency. This means that every country, when they want to buy something from another country, it's converted to dollars at the bank, and they're buying it in dollars. This is how the U.S. controls the world. It's the monetary system. And it's the international standard of value. That's why they have to exchange it to dollars, right, to do their trade. So as the dollar goes, so the rest of them go. And so the dollar's having trouble, and you're seeing all kinds of problems going on in Europe and problems with the euro. Well, they're all tied to the U.S. dollar. How did we get here? How did this debt money first happen and start happening? Well, right after the Middle Ages, soon after, the bankers had amassed a lot of money, and they would finance a war for a country. And then that country would go down the line and they have another war and they were in financial trouble, so they had to give the bankers more and more power. And over time, eventually, they would get the monopoly on the money. So world around, it's banks, it's the central banks that control all those governments, world around. Now the government occasionally will try and fight that, the government will, and then of course what happens? We make war on them, right? We won't let them adjust their economy to the reality of their world there. And we come to impose that, no, you got to keep doing this, keep doing the dollar thing. And that's how we all got into that place. And of course, Britain was the empire for a long time. But it first started with the Riksbank, which was the central bank of Sweden, and their war against Denmark. And the next one was Bank of England, and it took over that government. In every other country, similar crises of some kind happened and the banks took over. Give me control of the nation's money and I don't care who makes the laws, right? These guys are worth supposedly $100 trillion today. The Rothschild family. Catherine Austin Fitts had always heard about that and thought, oh, the Rothschilds own thing. Yeah, sure they do, Well, she got into the high into the financial system of this country, working for one of the big lawyers and investment houses I can't remember what their name was, but one day she's in there and there's this big decision that was to be made because that was going to make a big difference, and she was excited about it. And a Rothschild came into the office, somebody, the current whoever he is, and they had a meeting, came out and said, no, we're not doing that, and that was it. She was gone. Pretty soon she had the FBI knocking on her door and took all her computers and everything. But anyway, she fought that for a number of years and lost millions. So we talked about the different kinds of monies and what happened back in the 70s. I wanted to mention this because our money used to be backed by gold, right? And because we didn't have enough gold to back it, they took away, Nixon made the decision to go off the gold standard, right? Well, before, wages were rising with the productivity. But when he took us off the gold standard, because productivity was set to rise like crazy after the war, right? And by the 70s, it was obvious it was climbing like crazy. He took us off the gold standard and wages stayed flat and productivity climbed. Now, why? Didn't we should be doing good. We got all this productivity, right? They were able to produce a lot of money and do a lot of stuff with their money, but it was all the stuff they wanted to do, not what we wanted to do. So a lot of that represents stuff that's destroying our planet there. Because if we wanted to do stuff, the banks wouldn't let us do it. If we do what we love, what we want to protect, what we want to do, but let these guys have it. Well, what happened? 1971, went off the gold standard, and this is debt. This is government debt, it's private debt, it's corporate debt. More money, more debt, right? Because that's what money is in this system. So we have these huge amount of debts. Well, there's always got to be a correction, right? The big elephant in the room is derivatives. Now, derivatives represent over $2 quadrillion. It's 20 times what the annual GDP is. So it's not connected with anything on this earth. It's not connected with anything real. Not food, not washing machines, nothing. It is totally out there in what David Corten calls phantom wealth, right? It's all just electronic numbers up there. And they're not, and this is the thing that caused the crash part of it, because a lot of this was in mortgages, but they're still doing it. And push the right button, Howard. And of course, we had the crash, boom. Lots of people lost A few people won. A few people got a lot of money off of that. The crash wasn't too bad for them at all, was it? And we know partly why that was. Well, every time one of those things happened, they say, oh my God, this is the horrible thing that happened, you know, but it happens all the time. This is a clunker. Since 1970, there's been 145 bank crashes, 72 sovereign debt crises, 204 monetary collapses, 427 major finances. This is world around now. This is all connected to the dollar, but it's all these other countries having severe financial problems because of the way we issue money and the way that system works. It requires losers to pay the interest. People have to lose for it to work. Since 1637 through 29, there was 48 major meltdowns on the planet, major economic woes for everybody. This was the tulip bubble, right? That was the radio stocks bubble. And then we had junk bonds was one, you know, and the dot-com was one, and the mortgage bubble was another, you know. This is a clunker. If it was a car, you would have traded it in a long time ago because this thing doesn't work very well. But look, here's the tax rates, another little aside. The tax rates are pressured down, and then there's a depression, and then they go back up, and then they're pressured down, and we have another depression. Well, we had just a recession. They're still pushing them down. So we are headed for another Great Depression. Now, the currency experts out there are saying this could be one that collapses the entire Western civilization thing. This could be like the Roman collapse. It was also a monetary collapse. And at that point, the countries divided back up into their ethnic identities and stuff like that. So not a bad thing, really. If we're ready for it. If we can not starve to death in the process because we don't have any money. If we understand, we can issue money ourselves. The need for regulation is always the sign of a faulty design. One of my fellow architects likes to say this and point this out. If you need a lot of regulation in a system, that system is badly designed. I borrowed, a lot of this material comes from a lot of different people. We stand on the shoulders of many people, you know. And so I've been reading a lot of people. Well, one of them is Thomas Greco. And he's a Californian that you should all know because he does wonderful stuff about currencies and understands it. He says the money and banking have been politicized. No shit. But there's this general erroneous belief that we should hand the making of money and the issuing of money to the government. Well, now the government in this country had that power and they handed it to the banks. So why would we want to give it back to the government? This is what Kucinich and all of that, the monetary fund, American Monetary Institute, talking about issuing money back. Now a lot of the stuff and the goals that they have for what they want to do is wonderful. The goals are fine, but they don't go far enough. Okay, let the government issue money, that's fine. But don't ban it for everybody else. Don't make it the only money because that's a monopoly. And you know what happens with monopolies? You lose. And one person wins. And that's the way our whole economy has been running for a long time. Monopoly, they just did some research recently on the game monopoly, and it is a very good example of our economy on how it works, where it concentrates wealth and everybody else loses. And the behavior of the one who wins is always interesting because they become very insensitive to others' feelings and other people's losses and stuff like that in that process. And then in the research, they even figured out, take a rich person and a poor person and switch their places and give the poor person an advantage where they get 2 rolls and the rich person only gets 1 roll. And so they were disadvantaged. On the other end, suddenly the poor people were acting that way to the rich person, you know, but he wasn't rich in the game, you know, because it was the game. And so this is how our money works in our minds. And legal tender laws are what forces us to have to use this kind of money that is destroying the planet. So could you kindly rephrase that in unequivocal, inaccurate? No, we'll try to make it a little clearer. Try this. So what they're doing is we have a credit commons. It's built on trust. We all put into the commons. We all put our trust in the commons of credit in the world. And everybody's going to pay back their bills, and so everything is going to work. But the problem is, when we go to take money out of the credit commons, we don't get to do it for free. It's supposed to be a commons. We don't get it. How does that happen? Well, the only access we get to the commons is via the banks. Even the government has to go through the banks. That's why every single dollar was created as interest-bearing debt. And that means there has to be a bunch of losers. And there'll be just a few winners. And of course they live in here and work there. And so it goes to their biggest depositors, the people who are the wealthiest, and they get that interest. So we need to figure out a way where they're not there and we can access our credit commons we put in and we get to take out. And there's no reason why we should be charged for that. Yeah. Well, people say money talks. And Occupy was saying that they talk too much. And Dylan said, money doesn't talk, it swears. Right? Well, the effects of the monetary monoculture are this. It does a bunch of things. And there's probably more than what is on my list. But these are a few. The unrelenting concentration of wealth, we saw how that works. Drives a business boom and bust cycle, we see how that works. And it discounts the future. It encourages short-term thinking. That's subconscious in everybody. Everybody does short-term thinking. I've heard people talking about Green Party, doing this, doing that. All of it's been short-term thinking. But a monetary system is what engenders that kind of thinking. Now, everybody doesn't have to buy into that. We can do personal building and expanding and learning how to center ourselves and not be affected by these things and change our programming about how we treat people and stuff like that. We can do that. But it's not real powerful when you're just using that 5% of your mind that's just the conscious part of it. 95% is subconscious, and your subconscious mind processes calculations at something like 10,000 a second, whereas your conscious mind, you can do 40 maybe. So your subconscious mind is making a lot of those decisions that you don't even consider a decision. It's already been made. It's a given. There's a compulsory growth thing, right? Because there has to be these losers, you have to keep growing. You have to keep the thing growing so that there can be more losers and you can keep making money. Those things, and that's part of the monetary system that does that. It drives that. It supports an artificial scarcity because the money is scarce. The money stops more things than it facilitates. That kind of, in this money system that we have. And we all know that, right? There's a lot of things we'd be doing if we could get the money to do it. So it creates that predatory competition because you've got to not be a loser, right? So you're competing out there and trying to make it work, and that devalues social capital. And it's being compounded. They're charging interest on interest, right? So, as we know, and that drives it even worse and makes all of these things even worse. Well, how can we turn those things around? Yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for our shareholders. Why do civilizations collapse? What is it that Arnold Toynbee said? It's overconcentration of wealth, and it's an elite unable to make timely changes. We got that, right? Jared Diamond came along and said, well, it's also environmental degradation. Well, I think that might be what those unable to make the timely changes were about. You know, environmental degradation, where the corn wouldn't grow anymore, or the wheat wouldn't grow anymore, and stuff like that. So they have these reasons, and Bernard Lataire adds another one saying, it's also a monetary collapse, because in Rome and a lot of these cultures that collapsed, that had wonderful, prosperous civilizations, collapsed because of the money. Apocalypse. Apocalypse is a Greek word, means lifting of the veil. I think this is important because we all think of apocalypse as the end of the world. Well, it's the end of the world for the elite who were pulling the wool over our eyes, and the veil has been lifted, right? And much of that has been around the money and how they could use wealth to fool the people. And so when these things are revealed, the people can organize and change things. And we can do that today because we're having the veil removed. We're seeing how money works. Because for a long time, I didn't know. I mean, I'm 60 years old. It took me a while to find out that every single dollar in the world and every bit of money was created as debt through a bank, and that the interest wasn't created. I didn't know that. But that drives a lot of bad behavior.
You're 67.
Huh?
67.
I'm 67? Really? Oh, shoot, I'm past. Oh, I'm 67 years old, yeah. What did I say?
You said you're 60.
Oh, yeah. I'm definitely, it's going by so fast now I can't keep up. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the 20th century battle of ideologies and mention this because I think it's important. There were two schools of economic thought, right? We battled over this. And there was capitalism, which, you know, it's a free-for-all, and supposedly, and which is really a monopoly. And then there was communism. Well, communism was going to, you know, make all these co-ops, and we were going to do a big cooperative thing, right? And communism was going to demonstrate to the world these good social values of socialism. And there have been thousands of books written about the differences between those two, right? And then there's thousands of books written about the differences within each of those, right? How many of them have ever talked about the similarity between those two? And there's one key similarity I want to point out. And that is they both had the same kind of monetary system. They both had a debt-based monetary system where money was created at the instant of a loan and was interest-bearing debt. Now, they did that to their communities, and of course, they collected a bunch on the other end. The interest accrued to the party bosses. And imagine trying to do co-ops when you've got a money that encourages competition. It was kind of they were going to lose, you know, because the money was more powerful than the conscious mind trying to create that co-op. They were competing patriarchal systems, I might mention also. They were run by men with men's values and men's left-brain thinking. Now, in the 20th century, we had these two guys that were contemporaries, and they argued a lot. These two guys argued a lot about stuff. Because Marx was saying, and Marx, he didn't make much of a study of the economics. Money, you know, money was just this thing, it's just the medium of exchange. It doesn't have any power, that's not, get out of the way. It's that means of production and the property they own, and so we need a revolution to take it away from them. And so his thing was to organize for a revolt. And Proudhon was saying, yeah, but that's just going to get a bunch of people killed. And, you know, I think that capital is not their property, it's the money. It's the money that is the power in their thing. And how they're getting so much power in the form of money is because of the way money is issued. Money was being issued that way then, right? has debt. And he said, there's something in that economic mechanism that I know we can use for the workers, but he could never figure it out. He tried exchange banks, and he's like the #1 anarchist. In fact, he was the first anarchist who actually had that term applied to him. And he was a mutualist too, where started this mutualism kind of idea. He said property, what was the quote? Property is what?
Theft?
Theft, exactly. Property is theft. And, but he never figured it out, what that mechanism was. Who figured it out was, and that was some of this guy's quotes. This is Silvio Gesell. Now he was this guy born in Germany, went to Argentina, working for a shipping company, and he saw how there was a charge on shipping containers or ships that didn't get filled on time. There was a charge put on that. And he noticed how when that was instituted, that demurrage charge, it made everything flow faster. Nobody wanted to pay a demurrage charge, right? They didn't want to pay that, so everything moved faster, and he wondered, how did that apply to money? And so he wrote a book called The Natural Economic Order, where he went through talking about Marx and Proudhon. He says, Marx was wrong about capital, and Proudhon was right about this, because here's the money mechanism. And he started telling people about how demurrage currencies could work and help fulfill their needs. J.M. Keynes, during the Depression in the United States, pointed out that we'll learn more from Gesell than from Marx in the end. And that's what's happening now, because we're seeing the picture. And it's happening all around the world. There's something like 4,500 complementary currencies around the world, and they're popping up all the time. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. But he said that it's only money that goes out of date, like newspaper, like the things we buy. It's like everything we buy. If the money doesn't come down with it, then that just disconnects us from nature. And it skews the market. It messes up the market, because the money suddenly is this commodity that everybody wants to keep and wants to get lots of. So if we make money worse as a commodity, if we want to make a better medium of exchange. And I say that money no longer valued over goods and services then builds value in those intangible things, like relationships and community. And all of the things that we know are of great value, but we haven't been able to spend the time with our kids because we're out making money. We're out having to do this all the time. This money system keeps driving us into this because we don't want to be a loser, right? So that's what's going on. But if we can take that away, then we start valuing the things that are of real value, like our earth. Who should issue the money? The people should be able to issue the money. A business should be able to issue money. A nonprofit should be able to issue money, because we got things we want to do, right? If money's issued on a sound basis, there's no need to force people to accept it. Here's the thing, they say, well, what if I issue money and nobody wants to use it? Well, that's the free market. That's the way it works. But then again, if people want to use it, it shouldn't be stopped, because the free market, it's out there. So issue your money. Let's sort it out. There's all kinds of designs. We'll talk about those in a minute. But these things will help balance, just like nature's network, where one goes down, another one comes up. Switzerland's been doing that for years, and that's why their economy is stable, unlike every other economy in the world. Forced circulation, that concentrates power and expropriates wealth, right? Democratic government, and we said early on that it should be separated from this government. The government should not be able to run a monopoly. Your local government should be able to issue currency, but your national government shouldn't be in the business, in my opinion. And a bunch of other people that I stand on the shoulders of. Talking about the credit commons again. And here's how that credit clearing currency I mentioned earlier. See, this is like a network, so it's all over the place. It's really hard to organize in a thing. So this is going to jump around a little bit like that network. How does the clearing money work? When you sell something, your account goes up because you made some money, or you went out and you sold your productivity for something, you did your job, you got paid. And when you buy something, it goes down. Well, you can make a money that operates like that. It's just a card. It goes up and down as you are getting paid and spending it. And of course, zero is where you should be. Now, the other thing is, this can be on the web. Everybody can see everybody's account. So everybody knows who's got that big negative thing going on down there where it's taking advantage. And so they won't buy from his productivity. It's self-regulating in that way, right? Because when you see who's taking advantage, you don't do business with them in that kind of a system. And there's systems like that operating already at community levels around the world. And this can help us. And I want to talk about the accelerating pace of change a little bit, and you can see it in monies. Because the first human era for 4 million years, we were using shells or beads or different kinds of things that we created for money. In the agricultural area, what happened? Smelting, right? Metals. And so then we had coins. And so that was 3,000 to 5,000 years worth of that, right? Then the industrial era came along, and we had what? The printing press. And so we could use paper for our money. 300 to 500 years. Then we got into electronics, right? The digital era, 30 to 50 years. That's where we are now. We got electronic money out there. Most of the derivatives, right? That huge $1 trillion thing is in electronics. So consider this, a new era in 3 to 5 years that creates a new money. And what I'm thinking is it could create an era of peace and sustainable prosperity. And here's how. A little bit of monetary history. The indigenous people, these economies worked for a very long time. The British found out. They used to think these economies were working fine. They didn't need us. We had to make them somehow or another depend on us. Egypt had an economy that for 3,000 years was the envy of the world because it was so prosperous. The reason it was so prosperous was they had a demurrage currency as their national currency, and they had another currency, which was gold, that they traded with other countries. So that was the country that was at the top, but within the country they didn't use it. Within the country they used little clay chips that had a date and amount on it. Just a little clay chip scratched on there. When the farmer brought his grain to the storehouse, he was given this little clay chip, and it had the numbers on it that went down. Well, writing actually started because of this. The first writing was because of accounting. It was because of money, keeping track of the money. That's how writing started, right? So we have Egypt, successful thing until 30 BC. What happened? The Romans invaded and made their money illegal and made them use Roman money. And how, just the way the British did to Africa. In the Middle Ages, in the middle of the Middle Ages, there was a phenomenon that happened. A lot of people say it's because they had warm weather, and so they could grow more stuff, and that created this tremendous prosperity. But it was more than that, because during that period, after Rome collapsed, the people were in there, and there wasn't enough money from their local noble, right? They couldn't get enough money to do their trade, and so artisans started issuing money. The bread maker would issue currency for bread. The candle maker would issue currency for the candles. And the people would use these currencies to do the trade. Well, the baker, see, he wanted to buy flour and grains to grind into flour, and so he needed some money, so he printed up money that was worth the bread that he was going to make with the flour. And so that's like a business-to-business currency. Well, then the people started using those same currencies. And so you had this demurrage system. Well, the nobles figured out, well, hey, they're doing awfully good. I want a piece of the action. So they said, okay, we'll print the money, and we'll put out the money, and then we'll collect the money every year and take taxes, and then we'll issue it back. Well, that worked fine, too, because that was a demurrage currency still. You know, it wasn't issued as debt. It was issued freely. They just took a tax off of it. Huh?
What does demurrage mean?
Demurrage means that there's a tax on time, not on the amount, on the time that you keep it. And so if you keep it in the bank, its value goes down. And that's why, and it's what it was done was to discourage hoarding, discourage holding on to that currency, because that was the problem that people were having. In fact, there's a statement on the back of Wordle money that speaks to that. But the significant thing about the Middle Ages was, in using this demurrage currency, they were also a matrifocal society during that time, despite Christianity being a dominant thing. Women were very powerful during this time, and women had high places. They run the abbots mostly in towns, and so they had this very powerful position because people were worshiping the Black Madonna. The Black Madonna was an artifact that was actually brought over from Egypt, and it was a woman holding a child. And so they worshiped the Sacred Mother, because indigenous cultures forever, that's one of the archetypes they have, is the Sacred Mother, an important archetype in their psychology. And the Sacred Mother represents the earth. It also represents women. It also represents money. And all those cathedrals that were built was because they were thinking long term. The reason those cathedrals were built was to attract pilgrims, so that their grandchildren and their grandchildren's children would have money coming in. They were trying to figure out how to create a future for their children. And so they built these massive, beautiful cathedrals that were 4, 5, 10 times, much larger than the number of people in town it would take to fill them, much, be a few hundred people in town, the church will seat 400 or 500, or something like that, But these things were all named after women, and that's a significant thing. They were matrifocal societies, they were dual currency societies, and that is one of the characteristics of these kind of systems, because when we implement dual currencies, we start getting matrifocal values along with it, which is cooperation and community values and building social capital. The American Revolution I mentioned earlier, it's, as Ben Franklin said, it was because they outlawed the colonial currencies that were being issued by businesses and local governments, and the people were doing these local currencies, and of course they roared onto the world stage as an economic powerhouse. And England was, whoa, we're the empire. We don't want that going on. So they made them illegal and made them have to use the crown, the sterling, and they had to pay their taxes in that. And so that meant they had to do stuff for the British to get that money so they could pay their taxes. And that caused a whole lot of problems in this country. In the 30s, we had this depression come upon us, and it was whirled around. I mean, Europe was already deep in that depression after World War I, and Germany was forced to pay reparations. So everybody was suffering in depression back then. And there was a few people that were reading Silvio Gesell's books and saying, hey, we could just start issuing currency ourselves, forget the banks. And so they started doing that. The Wara was issued by a business. It was a coal company. They were bankrupt. They couldn't mine their coal because they didn't have any money to pay their workers. So they said, okay, we're going to issue a currency and it's worth coal. You can trade it for coal. Everybody needs coal for the heat in the winter, right? So that was a good currency. It took off and they started being able to fix up the town, do things around there. It spread to 2,000 businesses across Germany. It was roaring Germany into a new economic powerhouse in 1 year, 1931. And then the German bank stepped in and made it illegal. Well, the government made it illegal for the German central bank, right? And shut them down and plunged them right back into the depression, and unemployment went skyrocketing. And that's what they were trying to eliminate with the Wara. They eliminated their unemployment problem, got everybody employed. And then the government, so now you know why they elected Hitler. Because he demonized the banks, demonized the government, and they said, yeah, they shut us down. We had a successful going economy and they shut us down. It was in 1 year we had done all of these things and they shut us down. So they were very angry. And that's the kind of thing anger will get you, right? Not good. Well, the same thing happened in Austria and in 1932. And then the same thing happened in Switzerland in 1934. But I always tell a story. There's three monkeys, Wara, Wargle, and Weir. And these three monkeys knew how to create wealth. And so they started creating wealth. And Wara was the first one who started creating wealth. And he created this tremendous wealth, handing it out to everybody. And suddenly one day a big giant monkey came along and squashed him. Wargle was doing the same. He was a monkey creating wealth and sharing it with everybody, and suddenly this big monkey came and squashed him. And then Weir was very worried about all of this. So Weir started creating wealth very carefully. And it's still doing that today, 43 years later. Why? Because Switzerland doesn't have any giant monkeys. But I'll tell you what that is. FDR. But these things were having this tremendous success in Europe, right, during the Depression. And so 400 cities in the U.S. had heard about them because that word was getting out. That kind of success is incredible. And I'll tell you the story of the Wargle in a minute because that is a success story that should be inspiring. FDR, 400 cities wanted to start issuing Wargle bucks. Started wanting to do a demurrage currency. And he was talking with all the bankers and everybody, and they said, no, we don't want to do that. Make those illegal. Don't let them do that. Instead, you should borrow a lot of money from us and do a new deal. Right? And so you spend all this money and put the government, our country in debt, put our grandchildren in debt, right? Doing this. Instead. Now, they did a lot of good things, but they took people out of their communities. They took the working men out of their communities, spread them all around digging swales in Kansas or something, building, picnic sheds in Tennessee or something like that, all over the place, and never fixing the economy. What fixed it was the war, right? The war came along, and we've been on a war economy ever since. Because they make a lot of money off of war. I want to point out, too, that a society with only one currency is like hopping on one leg. You can't get too far before you're too tired to go on. And that's that boom and bust cycle, right? But if you have two currencies like Switzerland, when one goes down, the other one comes up, and that's why their economy is stable through all of the stuff that's happened since. All of those big bubbles haven't affected them. This is a Wordle dollar. And it had these little squares, one for each month, and you had to get a little sticker that you got from the bank or from your parish. They were sold around where you had to put that sticker on to make your money worth its full value again before you could spend it. And so everybody wanted to get rid of it before the next month, right? And so constant. So they issued 1,800 shillings worth, and in 3 days, taxes had been paid to the tune of 5,000. And they thought, somebody's counterfeiting money. How could that happen? But the mayor understood. The guy who had been reading Silvio Gasel's work said, no, that's the velocity of the money doing that. And they built houses for the poor. They had 400 families that were penniless. They built them houses. They paved the streets. They put trees in along the streets. They fixed everything up. And on the back of the Wordle dollar, and this spread also across Austria very fast, it said, to all whom it may concern, sluggishly circulating money has provoked an unprecedented trade depression and plunged millions into utter misery. Economically considered, the destruction of the world has started. It is time through determined and intelligent action to endeavor to arrest the downward plunge of the trade machine and thereby save mankind from fratricidal wars, chaos, and dissolution. This is in Germany. This was printed on the back of the money, or in Austria, really. Human beings live by exchanging their services. This is true. A sluggish circulation has largely stopped this exchange and thrown millions of willing workers out of employment. We must therefore revive this exchange of services. By its means, bring the unemployed back to the ranks of producers. Such is the object of this labor certificate, this dollar. And so the local government spent that money into the economy, and people did stuff with it, paid their taxes early, because they didn't want to hold on to it, right? Paid their taxes early. Money got spent back in, and so they not only built all those houses, fixed up the city hall, the streets, street lights, and trees along the streets. They also built a ski ramp, a reservoir, and a bunch of other stuff that they did to improve the community. So what it did, instead of that money going out of the community into the banks, central banks, instead that wealth was built in the community and enjoyed by the community. And we can still do that. We can issue currency, and communities are doing that, right? They're beginning to issue currency. We're getting to realize this is one of our basic human rights. Because if you've done anything or made anything or offering any service, you should be able to issue a currency for that. Look, I will do this for you if you will take this. You know, right? So you got this exchange going. And that is how money should be and is created, really, because that's what happens is you're only allowed to trade at the bank to make that money first, instead of you, the trader, being able to make that money.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
You see that communities are doing that?
Yeah.
Maybe in America it's doing
There's
that?
a few. The Ithaca dollar is a time currency like that. And I believe there's a few others that are started, but it's not happening in the United States, as you might imagine, like it's happening in Brazil.
So it would be considered illegal still here since
No,
we are? Or not
no,
necessarily?
no. There are, the thing is, that law may be on the books, but they're not enforcing that law because it's not a threat. They don't perceive it as a threat. And we should get those currencies going because they will connect unmet needs with underutilized resources. So unemployed people is one of those underutilized resources, right? And we got stuff we need to do. Let's create a currency, pay them to do it. And that's what these cities were doing.
So if I'm issuing a currency that says I'll do something for you in exchange for whatever you're doing for me now, but you have to make a claim in 30 days or 60 days, because that's, if I don't have it done in 60 days, you're out of luck?
Well, no, not completely. Because it depends on the system. There are different kinds of systems. That would be a service economy. That would be kind of like a credit clearing system,
Okay.
right? And that's what the time dollars are, Ithaca dollars, and LETs, and those kind of things. Those are credit clearing currencies. Now, they don't have that built-in anti-hoarding kind of thing. But there's not that much hoarding because there's not that much of it happening yet. 13 months, that Wardle money did incredible stuff in just 13 months before they made it illegal and stopped them from doing it. And it plunged them right back into the Depression with high unemployment.
Why didn't they revolt?
Well, that was a good question. Seems like they should have. But that takes the conscious mind and all this organizing and everything, whereas the money, it was just doing stuff for them. And it was changing their minds. They were cooperating with one another. And that made them mad, I guess, because that's what we got was war. And a lot of nasty behavior, bad behavior. The WEIR is a successful credit clearing today. That's the way it was. Now they made this less powerful. See, this is a little bit less powerful than demurrage currency, right? You see how that is? Because the demurrage currency drives lots of trade because people want to get rid of the currency. This is a little bit slower. And so it wasn't nearly as threatening. The banks did try to get rid of it in Switzerland, but the government wouldn't do it because it was so successful. Their politicians, right? And people liked it, so okay, well, we can't make it illegal.
In a prior discussion, before this workshop, I talked about the microloan
Yeah.
system. Now, it wouldn't be illegal to create your own currency if you wanted to help invest in someone else privately.
Investment, that's a different story.
Okay.
And I can't really answer that question very
But if you
well.
wanted to,
But I
give
can
people
tell
money
you
to,
about some currencies that are doing things in some of those poor areas.
right,
And this is one. This is the Bangla Pesa. In Bangladesh, Kenya, there's this favelas, it's where poor people have come to the city and there's no work for them and they're living in shanties around trying to scrape a living together. Well, some social workers in that area, some poverty workers said, well, we can lift this community out of poverty if we could issue a currency. And they networked 200 businesses together, people that do charcoal or grow beans or, any bit of productivity somebody did, they could be in the network. And then they issued the money to all of those 200 people and said, go to it. And this created a little economy and it started lifting the favelas. It improved their lives. They were being able to take care of each other better. They were feeding each other better. They were feeding their kids better. They were beginning to lift themselves out of poverty. The government kind of freaked out about it and they arrested 7 of the people who started the currency. The same thing happened in Brazil. They won their case in Brazil. And so that currency is back online. They expect that they will win their currency here too, because see, it didn't cost the government anything. It didn't cost them taxes. They didn't have to do anything. The people did it themselves, and they're happy and being successful. So why would you want to stop that? These questions, they keep doing it. We keep asking these questions. Why? Well, let's talk about the metrics of sustainability a little bit. Why is this money a sustainable system? And it had to do with Robert Ulanowitz, who did 25 years studying biomass's movement through ecosystems, and he studied all kinds of ecosystems all around the world. And they discovered from that it requires certain things, and that flow through that complex network system actually applied also to electrical systems, or an information system like your immune system, or a media system, or a money system. The same metrics of sustainability apply. And And what are those? Resiliency and efficiency. And also diversity and interconnectivity. These diversity and interconnectivity are required to create an economy. And efficiency and resiliency is how viable that economy is going to be. The more efficient it is, the more brittle it becomes. And so it collapses. And that's what we've got now. You know, we're out here, we're not in the window of viability here. So here's sustainability, here's resiliency and efficiency, and the window of viability they determined where you got 100% sustainability, and the only model we had was natural ecosystems, right? It's the only way you could ever study that. And they came up with that you had to be in this area and it had to be a balance of resiliency and efficiency. But we're pushing out here all the time, and it collapses every little bit, and they do some regulation to get it back online, and then it collapses again, and that whole boom-bust cycle is all going on out here. Well, we need to be here if we're going to save this planet. And how do we get resiliency? Well, there's another term for resiliency. What is it? Redundancy. The more redundancy you have in a system, the more resilient that system is. Okay, so you can hit a nuclear power plant and knock out a quarter of the country or something. But if there were lots of little solar power plants all over the place, you can knock out that one, you can knock out that one, you can knock out that one, they still have power all over the place. Right? So that's the difference. So you don't want it centralized. Ecosystems use the energy efficiently. They do it at ambient temperatures. They do more with less. Full employment in sustainable systems, they discovered. Everybody's doing their job, right? Everything in it. Wasting nothing. Everything is either repaired or recycled or reused. Abundance and redundance in those systems. Balanced efficiency and resiliency. And that's where we need to go. And they're adaptive. They adapt to the changes in this thing and reestablish all of these things every time it happens. The high level of diversity and interconnectedness. So the effects of a monetary ecology where you have multiple currencies in a country, it balances the boom and bust cycles, promotes long-term thinking instead of short-term thinking. Abundance, efficiency, broad-based prosperity, builds social capital, and it promotes good behavior. And that's the important one, is our behaviors are getting totally out of hand, as you can see in the headlines every day. We need to stop looking at those headlines, and we need to start creating currencies in our community that are solving the problems of the community so that people can realize what it is that really matters. And it's not Obama. I want to just tell you something about the slow money movement. You've heard about the slow money movement. Well, what I've been talking about is fast money, right? Money that moves fast. What they're talking about is in the slow money movement is trying to get people to realize that the basis of our economy is the ecology. It is the environment. That is the basis for any economy. Regal used to calculate the GDP every year by just taking the farmer's production and multiplying it by 7 times. He was accurate every time. Because that is the basis of our economy right there, is what the farmers produce, whether you know it or not. And so they're trying to convince people with money to invest in the soil and invest into, good agriculture, not GMOs, but organic agriculture, and doing all these good food things, slowing the money down. They would do better if we could issue currencies to speed the money up so that it could build a lot more gardens. Because they're trying to change human behavior on the front end, not subconscious human behavior. They're just directly in front. Change your behavior. Okay. Well, it doesn't work too well. Coercion has been working pretty good, but it's coercing us to do bad things. It takes a media campaign, education, humiliation. That's one of those things you get people to change their behavior. Monetary systems design changes human behavior as well. And I want to go back to that again, mentioning we use our brain 5% of the time in conscious creative, and our subconscious takes over and does most of what we do. Driving, walking, all of that stuff is operated subconscious. And much of our attitude and opinions about money is the same place. So, economics without input from psychology is like doing mechanics without physics, right? I mean, you don't have to know physics, but you know that mechanics depends on it. So, what are those psychological effects? And so there has been some scientists start to study it. And in 2006, this Kathleen Voss and a team of scientists around the world, and they did this in different places around the world to see what was going on. And what they did was interesting. They had 2 rooms. In one room, they put a big dollar bill, a painting of a dollar bill up on the wall. And they were asking these people to come into this room and fill out a survey. You know, a little survey about whatever. And in the other room, another test group of subjects was a picture of a seashell. Now these have both been used for money, but one's just a seashell and one's a dollar. What happened then? They put them people in the room and they started taking their survey, and then they had this window, you know, they looked in to see what they were doing. And they looked in the first room where the dollar was, and they found people sitting far apart. They were hesitant to ask others for help on some of the complicated questions on the survey. And they wanted to work alone. And they responded to a request for help with some insensitivity. They really weren't eager to help. And they thought, wow, that's quite an effect. And they went and looked in the other room, and what they found was people sitting around, close together, laughing and joking with one another, filling out the survey, talking about the survey and everything. And they said, wow, just the image of the money has a psychological effect on people. And it's all those subconscious things that come up and you start responding to. Well, let's talk about archetypes. Jung, in psychology, you know, he talked about archetypes. And he said, you know, the typical person in Western civilization has, you know, the sovereign, the warrior, the magician, the lover. Well, there's all kinds of archetypes, but those were 4 major archetypes he was using to try and understand the human psyche. But, and of course the sovereign, that was a very important one. That's the king. You're in control, right? It's all your right brain or left brain stuff. It's a very yang kind of archetype. The other archetype is, as I mentioned before, indigenous cultures had, was the sacred mother archetype. And it was more important than the sovereign. But it balanced the sovereign. It didn't eliminate the sovereign. It just balanced that sovereign. So you have yin, yang, right? Right brain, left brain, both working together. The sacred mother was a very important archetype. But in our culture, disrespected, degraded, drilled, smashed, whatever, you know, bulldoze it down. We don't have that in our psyche that the sacred mother is sacred. You know, our planet is sacred. And it's not in there. So this is a major disconnect from nature, and that causes a lot of problems in our world, and is causing a lot of problems in our world, because we need to reconnect with nature. And so we can do that with those demurraged currencies. It reconnects, it makes money not a commodity, it reconnects you to the natural systems, to the farmers' work, to their productivity. And, And so that's, I've talked about how demurrage works, and so we don't need to talk about that anymore. It builds social capital and promotes long-term investments. How does it promote long-term investments? This is another thing that works in your subconscious, but they mathematically figured out why it's doing that, and through a system called of net present value. And these are calculations economists do, and I don't do these things. But this is at zero interest. Say you had some pine trees in 10 years worth 100 and 100 years worth 1,000, right? And in net present value calculations, well, we have what is called a positive interest currency. That's what the dollar is. So if you figure at 5% what those investments are going to be, you see right away why we have short-term thinking. That's why we have short-term thinking. Now, the people of Wurgel didn't do net present value calculations in their head. They picked that up subconsciously. They started thinking long-term. It was because of the money. It wasn't because they had to think about that. It was because here's what happens in negative interest money. Instead of a 5% plus interest, 5% negative interest, and you get this kind of dynamic. And suddenly, long-term investments are the investments you want to make, because those are going to provide by far the greatest return. That's what was happening in Egypt. That's why they built those pyramids. That was what was happening in Central Europe, and that's why they built all those cathedrals. They were thinking about the future. And we can do that too. Now, the interest has a very interesting effect on things, because positive interest, these are all the behaviors of that. Now, that's not all bad, right? You know, not all bad. Some technology skills are good to have, right? Efficiency is good to have, as long as you've got some resiliency to balance it. Linear thinking is okay as long as you've got some nonlinear to balance it, right? Well, that's what happens in societies that have a positive national currency and a negative interest local currency. And it starts creating matrifocal values. And how they're doing is connecting unmet needs with underutilized resources. This is one of the most important things about this. And I could talk about it. It's a chaotic system where you're, where neither system dominates, but both are present. And that's what they call a chaotic system. And so it's being reinvented, complementary currencies. Let's see here, let me get to where this is. And this is who's doing it. This is the movement that's going on around the world. Voluntary, grassroots, social action groups are figuring out currencies like mutual credit, LETs, and other community currencies around the world. And businesses, for-profit businesses, they're also issuing complementary currencies. And because the banks won't give them the money to continue business, so they aren't going to put up with that, and they start issuing their own currency between other businesses or with their customers. The miles is one of the biggest complementary currencies in the world right now, and of course it's only a commercial currency to sell their empty seats, but it's a tremendously popular one, and it's created some good behaviors in that kind of a network. Legal, so these are different kinds of, that's a B2, let's see, that was a B2C, that's business to consumer. That's what the miles are. And then there's barter currencies between businesses, the B2Bs, the C2, there's all kinds of combinations of these things that are being designed and are emerging as we speak. Mutual credit systems, time credit systems, demurrage systems, 4,500 currencies around the planet. What are some of those? The furry kipu. Furry kipu means carrying relationship ticket. In the 1950s, after the atomic bomb and all of this stuff in Japan, there was a lot of sick people, a lot of people needed to be taken care of, a lot of disabled people, and a lot of old people. And they started paying the women in Japan on a certain currency. And it gradually evolved into, today, the furry kipu is in 300 cities around Japan, taking care of their elderly. People are paid in the furry kipu. Now the people, the elderlies, say, I want somebody who is willing to accept the furry kipu, not the one who will accept the yen, because what I find is the people that will accept the furry kipu are nicer to me. They give me better care. And so it's a preferred currency. Well, the businesses and the shops in the neighborhood, they like it too, because they got old people and disabled people that need taken care of too, so they accept that currency. And it has created local economies. Japan's economy collapsed in the 90s. And this is how they're surviving. That's not the only one. They've got other currencies, and they've tried a bunch of different things. They're experimenting around, and that's what we need to do. Lots of currencies out there doing it in different ways. This is the Biwa tickets. This was taking care of Lake Biwa, which was this polluted lake, and they started paying people to fix it up, to do restoration work around the lake. And the shops accepted because they want that lake fixed, because it's a sacred lake, and it was an important lake, supplied fish and stuff like that to people. So it was a currency that created Curitiba, Brazil. This is quite a story. It was a town of 100,000 people in the 60s, and by 1970 it was 2.5 million people. And it was surrounded by favelas, which were with narrow streets, you know, these shanty towns. And they couldn't get garbage trucks down through those shanty towns to collect the garbage, and so disease started emerging in these favelas, people dying, and it was a potential disaster that was coming on to them. They didn't know how to do it because the city of Curitiba had no money to do that. They were barely keeping their system going as it was. The federal government wasn't going to give them any money to try and solve that problem, even though these diseases were coming on. So they elected this guy who was an architect, mayor. And he got a bunch of his architect friends together and said, what are we going to do? And they said, well, what kind of resources do you have that you have excess of? They said, well, we've got a bus system that we can't, you know, people can't afford to ride it. We don't have enough people, you know, utilizing our bus system. And we have lots of land, productive land around growing, that can grow lots of food, but that's not happening. We said, well, let's create a currency to fix that. So they started issuing bus tokens to people who brought a trash bag out of the favelas and drop it in a dumpster. And they got a bus token so they could go to town and get a job. That started happening, and they said, oh, that's working pretty good. How about we do it with food too? Okay, all right. If you sort your garbage into recyclables, then we'll give you a token for food. Oh, okay. Then those favelas were cleaned up in a few weeks. In a few weeks, stuff was happening. And a small local economy started emerging because they started developing other currencies to get the kids school notebooks. And every problem that they had, they kept figuring out how they could incorporate a currency to help that out. They didn't have tax dollars to spend on it. But the people are productive, and that's where our wealth is, people. Cuba, when Russia went down, right, the USSR went down, and they didn't have that trading partner anymore. They had problems. They needed to start growing their own food in big time, and the organic farmers started producing it, and the government would come in and mess it up, and they said, no, you can't do that. You need to let the people run it. And, by the way, we need to start issuing a currency. And so I saw an article not too long ago about Cuba, and they said, why is Cuba's economy still surviving? Well, it's because they have dual currency, and that's what's keeping them happy. J on the $3 bill. About that. Anyway, you're going to need that international exchange. This is a proposal that's out to do a basket of commodities that could be an inflation-proof international currency for establishing international standard of value. Not a bad idea, instead of the dollar. And let's time dollars There's also the electronic money coming online from computers, you know, free coin, Bitcoin, Feathercoin, Litecoin. There's all these, and I don't understand those things at all. But that could be the money we use in the future. I want to talk about the Torcus and the wellness tokens. This is where they were paying people to not smoke, to take hikes, to anything that you were doing that helped your wellness, you could get money for. And it was to help the healthcare system, take the load off the healthcare system, help people get healthy without it costing their healthcare system. This one was a town in Belgium where they had this huge immigrant population of poor people, and they said, what do you guys need? You know, we want to help you, but we don't know, you know, what do you need? And they said, we need garden space. So they developed a currency that paid them to create those garden spaces. Said, hey, we also need the town fixed up, we need this building painted and all that kind of stuff, and they would pay it in that. So they created this currency where they were paying all of these immigrant people to do all this stuff and created a local economy. And now they're producing food, it's sold in the local market, and there's this whole self-sustaining economy going on there in this little town called Torcus. The Sabre and the Dora, these are educational currencies. These are directed at education. The Sabre, or Sabar, as I think it's pronounced, is in Brazil. And it was designed to give money to children, give money to young students coming into the university system. But they started down in the lower grades of school. I'm not sure which grade, but down there around 10 years old or something like that, you would get money. And that money was to be spent on your education, and who you would get to do that was other students who were above you in the system. And they would pay them, the Sabres, to teach them. Well, that turned out to be a really good thing because you get a better education then. Because it turns out that from a lecture, you retain about 5% of it. Reading, you retain about 10% of what you read. And on and on and on until you get down here. What's the best way to know something? Teach it. Because you have to organize your thought about that subject in such a way that you really know it. And when you can convey that to another student, you've learned it better. So see how that complementary currency can create a much better education system. And that's how we get to a balanced system, folks. Basically, there's a number of resources out there. Now, a lot of this material came from Thomas Greco, Charles Eisenstein, and as I mentioned, Proudhon, and Sylvia Gassel, and all those. But these are the guys that are writing today. Bernard, and he's written a whole bunch of books with a bunch of other people. Jackie, what's her name, is going to be speaking at the Democracy Convention coming up, and she is Jackie Dunn. She wrote a book with Bernard Laterre about currencies, and she's going to be talking about it there. Community Forge is a Swiss company, a Swiss nonprofit that supplies tools. They supplied the tools to Bangladesh for creating their complementary currency. It was bringing people out of poverty, and COIN is another one of those nonprofits that's out there helping people with complementary currency systems. And like I said, there's all kinds of them, and that's what we need, is lots of them, because that is an ecology, and ecologies depend on diversity and interconnectivity. And so we need lots of complementary currencies. We need to say, keep your dollars, let's figure out a different way to do this. And that's it. Like I said, trying to organize that kind of information is really, I've found it to be, because there's so much to know, and so much I don't know.
Well, I think you did a great job.
Thanks.
One thing I'd like to comment on about the Newton.
Yeah.
My father was in the Civilian Conservation Corps. They did take these men out of the communities, but he was required to send all but a few dollars
Back.
to
Right.
his parents and his younger siblings. So
Right.
in those regards, it was a very good program in that it built the infrastructure in many parts of this country that I've been to,
Right.
Appalachia and also in the West. That program worked. It helped his father and his younger siblings, I should say. And so that the money wasn't just, his needs were taken care of at camp where he
It
was.
kinda-
He didn't need for much.
Right. It reminds me though of that old saying, if you give somebody a fish, they fed themselves for a meal. If you teach them how to fish, they can keep on doing it. And of course, that's was government money coming out of government, which was just increasing debt. And who pays for that debt? The taxpayers, all of us, because that's all backed, all of that debt is backed by taxpayers. So that debt chart that we saw up there, that's all guaranteed that we're going to pay for it, and our children and their children are going to pay for it. And we can reverse that.
Well, that debt, at least in my views, was very fruitful. It came back, it developed areas of the West, and parks and roads.
Absolutely.
And bridges.
But I think the
Not-
idea
would
would
never
be if
argue
we
that.
had been able to implement the 300 and some odd local currencies that were already in process, that would have happened anyway, only it would have happened in a more tangible way where the community
And a
was
more
actually,
democratic.
you know, yeah, improved and was able to take that on. And there was no debt associated with it at all.
They would have had a much harder time getting us to go to war too. If we had a whole bunch of successful, if 300, 400 cities across the country were having booming little economies during what was supposed to be a depression.
Do you believe the unemployment rate is falsely inflated?
Of course. You know, people have fallen off the list a long time ago, you know, and they're still falling off the list in greater numbers today than before. So we are headed, that little tax thing I showed you, the taxes going down, you know, we're headed for a big meltdown. And the more of those complementary currencies, the more communities are aware of it at least. And if they have something implemented even, when that dollar goes down, that will come up. It will rise like a phoenix from the ashes, you know, like a lion.
By taxing the transactions on Wall Street, all that wealth has gone to Wall Street at 1%. Taxing the Robin Hood tax, I believe, helped.
And it's not even real wealth. It's like that phantom wealth, right? You know, so it's not the stuff that's going to feed people. And so we can create that. And they can have their electronic numbers in this thing that's going to collapse.
Have you seen Collapse from Michael Weaver University?
No. No.
And she wrote for the Firm in Wilderness for quite a time, and he just was tormented. You know, he was the narcotics officer that busted the CIA
Right.
in the Iran-Contra
Right.
meeting writing. And he talks all about the monetary system. And there was I think it was a discovery history and they showed it was called Prophets of Doom.
Uh-huh.
And he had all of these experts in the field talk about what they think is going to be the sort of the catalyst for collapse, you know. That was really very interesting. So if you Google it or something, it's just a lot of very much along the lines of what you just laid out.
Tulips was the basis of this huge economy, you know, and like, hey, come on, you know, you could eat tulips, I suppose, but it was way overvalued. And so here we have a little electronic numbers way overvalued.
What about the Fed that, I'm sorry, Eddie, what about the,
Got a hand up
Sure.
over here from Bob, and I'd like to hear from Bob.
But you sort of denigrated the idea of money being a store of value.
Yeah.
Like, and the question that somebody asked back here about, well, what happens after you barter your time and get time dollars
Can answer
back,
that.
you know,
Right.
and you don't get them back after 2 months at the same
So
level
what
as
you
what
do-
you bartered.
Instead is you buy a savings instrument.
You what?
A savings instrument.
What's that?
You want to save some money, you buy something, and it could be currency, it could be the dollar. You want to save something, you know, buy something that will appreciate in value. And that way you can have savings. But your medium of exchange that people are using shouldn't be a store of value, because then people hoard that. It takes it out of the system when currency is supposed to flow, current. That's what that means. And so it should flow constantly. And you can have separate instruments for savings. You know, you can buy something that, a share of a forest that keeps increasing in value, or a herd that increases in value. And you can, in fact, it would create a whole industry of savings instruments if we had that kind of a currency available in a national scale. I'm pretty sure, because that, you know, that would create an industry of how to save your money. Now, in Wurgle, people were worried about savings. How come I can't save? Well, it turned out they were able to save much more because there was so much wealth. They were able to buy things that they could save, things of value, things of gold, whatever, that they could save. And so they said, where I could save $5,000 before, I was saving $20,000 now, because there was so much circulation of the money. And so they could divert some of that into savings where they didn't need. They spent that money on some kind of a savings instrument, who then spent it on something. You know, that money kept flowing because nobody wanted to keep it. You know, that money wasn't considered valuable. It just did stuff for them. It was an exchange. Yeah.
How do you deal with inflation? It seems like that's sort of a de facto.
It doesn't, inflation doesn't happen with that kind of a system.
But it's sort of a de facto demurrage, because the dollar,
That's often been said, but in demonstrating it, never happened.
but the dollar isn't, the dollar actually has declined in value pretty steadily over time.
And it's going to continue, and that's why, and it's artificially held up. You know, they keep printing more money to try and keep that value buoyed, but that, of course, devalues over time, and it's going to go down. At some point, people are going to say, and of course, it's already starting to happen, right? Some of the countries are already, and so when that goes down, that's going to affect the U.S., because most of us grew up with it being the exchange.
But doesn't that provide some of the same incentives to spend the money, because it's going to go down?
Inflation is a problem because suddenly it takes a wheelbarrow to buy a loaf of bread. To
But
me, it
that's
just
what-
doesn't work that way.
That's what you were talking about with money decreasing and these other currencies decrease in value if you don't spend them. That's what inflation is
Yeah, I mean,
essentially.
the velocity of money was probably the fastest in the hyperinflation in Germany.
That's what I mean.
You got paid at noon and you went out to buy stuff.
Right. But that's because, and of course, that plunged them. They were in straits. So the Wurgle,
It just sounds similar to what you're talking about.
it sounds
Well, I think,
similar,
too, one of the
but that, in the math
comparisons-
doesn't work that same way.
One of
You
the
know.
comparisons that I think that you left out when talking about that demurrage in the idea is, if we were using grain for our commodity at some point, and you take the grain and as your farmer, you go and you put it in the silo, and the guy gives you your little chips, the grain's gonna get eaten a little bit by mice, some of it's gonna rot. There is a natural degradation of a static thing. And that is when you have the currency reflect what is naturally occurring in natural systems, which are resilient when we base it on natural systems.
You don't get inflation.
then you don't get inflation. And yes, you're going to see that thing devalue if you hold on to it. You're trying not to hold on to it. The idea is you get paid, you go out, you move it along. And that's how come when they only printed so much money, within hours, taxes were paid to a greater extent. Because that money had already gone through many, many hands, not just one person. And so that was how many people got to pay the taxes with the same piece of money. And it's that movement that allowed that to happen.
The lots of trade, it facilitated trade, whereas the bank money was stopping trade. Stopping people from being able to do what they needed to do, to feed themselves, to build a house or whatever. So they created a currency to avoid that. Now, inflation, that's a different problem. That's a problem with the positive interest currency.
And value being held within the
And
dollar.
being, yeah.
I don't see how positive interest currency relates to inflation. I mean,
Yeah, right, and my explanations aren't that clear, so I suggest reading Thomas Greco or Bernard Latour and others on currency and how these things works, because I think if we understand these, we're going to see that the revolution is going to happen in money memes. The memes of money are going to change society to the point where we can change it to doing what we love, getting people to do the things that they love and want to do, and taking care of each other like they want to, and money won't be the problem in the way. That will change human behavior in the process of doing that. And these are the kind of things that have already been proven in Egypt, the Middle Ages, proven in the 30s, proven mathematically. So we should start maybe considering them as a positive, because we've been taught that there's only one kind of money that's worth anything. It's our money, it's the dollar, and everything else is just a problem that gets in the way of our money, because our money is the only money that's any good in the world, right? And when it gets removed from being the international standard of trade, the United States is going to learn some lessons about money.
Or can you get all these resources on the website, or?
Yeah.
It may not be that up to date.
I don't, yeah. I can get it
You can
now.
make a point of doing that.
I can make a point of doing that, yes.
That'd be great.
But the whole talk, is it on their website?
No.
It'll
No,
be on
I'm-
YouTube.
Just,
Oh,
it'll be on YouTube.
Okay.
Right.
But there are other talks out there. Look for Bernard Latour, who's been
Excellent.
tirelessly going around doing this, trying to educate people about how money works so that we can make it work for us.
Sorry, I couldn't sit anymore, but.
I understand.
And I'd like to invite you all to help our local economy by going out to supper tonight. I'm from the area. If you have
Absolutely
some,
will.
Suggestions on restaurants that can serve food dietary.
Locally owned ones.
Locally owned ones, yeah, there's a restaurant called Devotee on North Lynn Street. That is.
Oh, that sounds good already.
Chef Kurt Fries. I don't know what he's cooking up, but it's always local food. And he's a pretty activist in the local food